We are really, really delighted that the office gave us this chance because we're just a small group of climate activists and fellow travellers, and we're very lucky, I think, to have somebody from the office come to talk to us. So I'm very delighted to hand over to Sam. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm
Your
very pleased for the
question.
invitation. I'm going to do what's normally the most challenging part of these proceedings and share my screen. Um, so if somebody could let me know if that's successfully shared.
Yep.
Brilliant. Um, I joined the Future Generations team relatively recently, just before Christmas, and my role is all about involving people in the work of the office and what the Commissioner does, and hence being with you this evening, because I think making sure that we're involving activists across Wales in what we do is so important. So I'll just start off very briefly just with a little bit about me for context. So I grew up in Derby and I've lived in Wales about 15 years after studying biology and then working abroad for a couple of years. And just sort of picked a selection of photographs that sort of sum up, I suppose, partly why the Future Generations Act is something I'm so passionate about, and some of my motivation for the activism I do as well outside of work around the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. So the top left, that's me out on a run. I live in Penarth, and so I'm very privileged to live near the Wales coastal path. And when I was looking back through my photos, my lockdown photos, what I noticed were that a large proportion of them were of nature. So, like that one in the top, mussegull, fung, all types of nature that when we've been out on walks as a family, that's really what's sustained me, I think. And in terms of thinking about future generations, on the top right, that's our youngest. We've got 3 children. That's our youngest, Tavy. And I can't tell, I was trying to decide if I thought that was a butterfly or a moth in her hands, but I think that sense of, delight and joy and curiosity that young children naturally have towards nature is so vital, isn't it? And gives me hope, really, for the challenges that are ahead of us. And it makes me sort of sad and angry to think of the loss of in biodiversity just over my lifetime, really, and that sense of what we owe to young people now and to future generations to do what we can to restore that. So the picture in the bottom middle, that's Tavy and I in London. That must be 2019 now. I think that's the autumn rebellion. So we're outside the Home Office there, helping to block the road. Tavy had a colouring sit-in, and we sort of left before it all really kicked off with people changed to trucks and things, but we'd gone down with some friends. So I think for me, that sort of, I feel like it's a real privilege to work in the Future Generations team, and for kind of my activism and things I'm campaigning on in my own time to, now that I'm able to work on something that's so closely aligned with that feels like a real opportunity. So that's enough about me. So if I sort of go on,
Sorry, Sandy. I just
somebody definitely a question. Yeah.
as I'm really sorry I forgot to say this, but as Sandy is talking now, if you have a question at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat facility. Those of you who haven't seen that, it's a little bubble, speech bubble with chat. You click on it, you can write in any either comments for Sandy to see or any questions. So then we can take those questions.
Brilliant.
After a presentation. I'm sorry I forgot to say that.
Oh, no, thank you, Sue. I'm glad you did say that. And yeah, really happy to answer people's questions at the end. I can't see the chat bar, but I think Sue and perhaps Chris are going to help me by relaying those questions to me at the end. I was just talking about the national conversation, which many young people and community groups all across Wales fed into this process of coming up with a vision for ein gweledigaeth ni o dyfodol disgla. So what was this sort of bright future that was envisioned for Wales, and that fed into what is now the Future Generations Act. Oh, and that doesn't want to let me change slides. Okay, so Out of that conversation, the themes that emerged were distilled down into what we have today, which are the 7 national wellbeing goals in the Act that collectively encompass all of the aspects of sustainable development. So, how do we reach a point where we have a prosperous Wales, so an economy that works for everyone essentially, and yet we're still a resilient Wales, so we're managing to achieve that without destroying our environment. So the Act focuses a lot on how we can become a healthier Wales and also more equal, and of course equality, as we know, is very closely linked to health. So a Wales of cohesive communities looks at, what do we need to make our communities work well and ensure that everybody has housing and access to all the services they need. The Act also focuses on culture, and having a thriving Welsh language, in that sense that we can't really achieve in a meaningful way this better, brighter future unless we think about how culture and the arts really fit into that. And then lastly, but certainly not leastly, a globally responsible Wales encourages all of the policymaking in Wales to think about what's the impact of this beyond Wales's reach for the rest of the world. So the other essential part of the Act that came out of that big national conversation was the 5 ways of working. So these commit the Welsh Government and all of the bodies covered by the Act to work in a set of important ways. So kind of going around anti-clockwise. So the first one is about collaboration, so ensuring that all the public bodies work together, that they work with other organisations as well, in particular third sector organisations and charities. Then we have integration. So thinking about how, for instance, if you think about carbon reduction, making sure that those policies aren't siloed. So we're not just looking at that from, say, an environmental portfolio point of view, but across all of the government's different areas of work. Then we have prevention. So the Act asks all decision makers to invest and to plan for services that will prevent problems from occurring in the future, rather than simply sort of waiting until they occur. So health is a really good one to think about in that context around, how can we plan for better, healthier communities that will prevent people from becoming ill, and ultimately we can reduce that NHS spend. The binoculars are all about long-term thinking. So of course, this is really central to the Act. So this legislation, one of the reasons that it's so groundbreaking and world-leading, as Sue said earlier in the introduction, is that it enables governments, for the first time, requires the government to think about the very long term. So 25 years is often what we talk about in the context of the Act. And thinking about those generations still to come, when we consider that at the moment the government, often it's sort of bound by the electoral cycle, and organisations too are sort of bound by their targets, annual targets, etc. So the Act requires us to look beyond that, and make more long-term based decisions. And then the one at the top in the green, this is all about involvement. So this is where my role comes in the team. And the Act requires all of the public bodies to involve citizens in delivering the Act and in planning and implementing all their services. So just very quickly, I keep using the word public body. So this is a list of all the public bodies that are covered by the Act. So of course the Welsh Government, but then we've got all of the local authorities, the 3 national parks, fire and rescue, the health boards, a range of organisations like Sports Wales, Amgueddfa Cymru, and then you've got your 19 public service boards. So this is a structure that was put in place by the Act, and essentially it's where all of these other organisations come together on a local basis with representatives of the third sector as well to implement the Act and to look at, what does wellbeing mean in the local area and how are they going to deliver that. So as Sue said earlier, Sophie Howe is our current Future Generations Commissioner. So Sophie is the first commissioner. She's been in post since the Act came into place in 2015, and her role is to advocate for future generations, to be there to sort of argue their case and to really sort of set that radical agenda. So we've already talked about the M4, and that's a really good example of Sophie being able to step in as the commissioner and say, look, this decision is not in the interest of future generations for these reasons, and so we have to rethink. And that's a good example of the Act really kind of having teeth and being able to change the outcome of government policy. So that's a picture of Sophie in her TED talk in the middle. So increasingly Sophie is getting lots of opportunities to do international work and to sort of do that ambassadorial piece really for Wales of, you know, this is what we're doing here, let's try and influence other countries to instigate future generations legislation. So the other role that Sophie has is to try and kind of nudge the debate in a more radical direction. So there are lots of different policies that Sophie and the rest of our team are advocating, some of which I'll talk about in a moment, that kind of our aim is to sort of move things along so that more radical ideas are considered, you know, more and more considered the norm. So the example there on the left, thinking about, you know, what if we had a shorter working week and how that might benefit both people's well-being and the environment and the economy. So last year, Sophie and the team published the Future Generations report. So this was a big and important piece of work that drew together a lot of the intel and the recommendations and the findings that have been gathered from involvement across the 5 years of the Act. And then we've distilled that down into a series of recommendations. So we also have our manifesto for the future, which has top 48 recommendations that Sophie is making both to Welsh Government and to the public bodies of things that they could do to make a real difference to wellbeing. So what I've done in the next couple of slides is just pull out, I'm not going to run through all 48, don't worry, but what I've done is to pull out some of the ones that I thought might be of particular interest to you as an audience, sort of thinking from a climate and ecological crisis point of view. So I've made these a lot briefer than they appear in the report, just so that it wasn't too wordy on the slide. So you can go to the manifesto for more information. But within a prosperous Wales, one of the things that Sophie is advocating is for the application of wellbeing economics in all policies. So to think rather than simply about the financial bottom line around, you know, how do the decisions we make, particularly in government spending, impact on wellbeing. All policies should ensure that we're moving towards a more equitable distribution of wealth. And I think, you know, certainly with looking through a climate change lens, there's no doubt, is there, that one of the big problems is the vastly unequal distribution of the world's resources and wealth, and where that's led us to. So all decisions should look to protect the planet's resources for future generations and for other species. So then within a resilient Wales, we're calling for habitat restoration, targets for nature recovery, and species specific recovery. So I think this is a really important thing. I think the climate crisis has attracted much more kind of policy support from politicians, but that sense of making sure that nature recovery and the ecological crisis is as focused on is really important. So then two of the things that I pulled out that I thought would be of interest are a recommendation that, so this is really for planning, to make sure that everybody can access natural green space within 300 metres of their homes. And I think, you know, certainly during lockdown, that's really shown how unequal access to nature is and how much that can impact on people. And then lastly, calling for investment in responding to the climate and nature emergency. So then a couple of recommendations under cohesive communities that I thought would be of interest to you. So again, a kind of planning style recommendation to introduce what's called the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. So this is the idea that all communities are designed in a way that you know, the services people need and access to things like park and leisure are all accessible within 800 metres. And of course then, you know, this enables people to walk, cycle, etc. Instead of having to jump in the car. And we're also recommended that all publicly funded housing developments are to be carbon neutral. So just wanted to highlight some of the partnership working that we're doing. Hopefully I'd finished, yeah, covered off this slide before you lost me. So I was just talking about the 6 principles. We're very keen and promoting this work in meetings that we're having with other organisations to make sure that this stays in the front of people's minds. So one of the things that that we do is to share good practice and different case studies. So this is one of the ones that we've got on our website at the minute. So kind of in terms of examples of the Act being used and the difference it makes. So this is an active travel case study. So here we've got Cardiff Castle and before and after. So obviously lots of cars going past the castle before, and we've seen that a lot of the street space has been reclaimed for walking, cycling, for street art, for cafe space. And Cardiff Council are really sort of embodying the Act in terms of the health and well-being and environmental impacts. So this is another place in Cardiff. This is just by the River Taff. I cycle along here quite a lot with the kids, and it's really transformed in terms of how it feels to cycle here. It feels a lot safer. They've done some really good stuff. All of the planting is a kind of sustainable urban drainage project, with it being right by the Taff and liable to flood. So yeah, so that's a really good example. We're just going to move on to talk quickly about some of the local context in terms of the Act and how it applies locally. So all of those public service boards that I mentioned earlier all have to produce what's called a local wellbeing plan. And similarly with the Act itself, there's a big involvement process that goes on as part of that. So the plans were originally made in 2017, and there would have been a big consultation process to sort of do an assessment locally of what the priorities were. So I took this screenshot, is from Swansea's local wellbeing plan, and so you can see on the right there that 4 themes emerged from that consultation work that the Public Service Board did. So the plan for you locally focuses on the early years, on living well and aging well, working with nature and building strong communities. So this is an opportunity to sort of get involved with what's happening locally around the Act. So the public service boards are just beginning the process of refreshing these plans and planning how they're going to involve people locally and consult. And that will happen over the next kind of year and a half. So I've got a couple of slides now. This is another of our case studies, and as you can see, it's local to yourself. So this is a nice example from Swansea. So I suspect some of this might feature in your talk that you mentioned, see that Adam Land is going to do on retrofitting. So this study focuses on how Swansea reacted to the COVID crisis and the need to do something, very quickly and rapidly about the homelessness problem in the city, and how that's now being built on to think about tackling, the need to have more environmentally friendly housing, and also how that links with reducing fuel poverty. So there are a couple of case studies included in here. So one is Craig Kevin Park retrofit. So lots of focus there around, installing renewable energy and making the housing more fuel efficient. And then the other one, Copper Bay, so looking at what might a development of the future look like that has zero carbon housing for people, and this feature, so this is a partnership project with Pobble. As you'll see at the bottom there, it talks about biophilic living. So this is the sense of designing buildings to incorporate more of the positive features about nature and how that can help people. So I've only got a couple more slides left. So I popped this in. This is literally from today's news. So there was a feature on the BBC earlier about how some of the third sector organisations in Wales, so I think RSPB, WWF and Size of Wales, are calling for Wales to be the first deforestation-free nation. And I thought this was a lovely example of something that really, really fits with the Act. So what this would mean essentially is that local authorities would ban the inclusion in school meals of any food that is linked with deforestation. So anything that has palm oil in, or chicken that's been fed on soya grown on deforested land. So I think this would be really inspiring if this happens, and it's a really good illustration of how important it is for kind of civil society and organizations to be calling for these policies that really embody the Act, and how powerful that can be. That leads me to my final slide, which essentially is about all of you. So we talk a lot in our team about what we call building a movement for change, and I'm a really strong believer in the power of communities and the power of people to make change, and activists to make change. So I think for us it's about what can we do to enable you to use the Act to amplify what you're doing and to help with your activism. And yes, I guess that's partly why I'm here this evening, to speak with you all and to learn about what your kind of perspective on the Act, and how it is helping you hopefully already, and how it might be able to help you more in the future.
Well, I think maybe it might be a good idea, while we're waiting for her to come back, if people would like to make some of their first responses to, and maybe people feel they already knew everything that she said, or some people may be the first time they've really heard it. I saw that Jim asked, has the Act had any notable impact on decisions being made by local authorities? I certainly know from my own work with social care that jobs have been all restructured to take into account well-being. Is that her? And people are very, very aware of it in the public sector and know that they're supposed to be working towards it.
I found it really interesting because I didn't really know much about what they were doing, and I like graphs and things that make it easy about the involvement in local politics and different organizations. And I think it's just generally it's quite good for somebody like me who works with a lot of different people to be able to say to different organizations and different people that this is available, because I think it can get lost a lot. So
this is Jim, and I guess my question about local authorities, as far as I can see, and some of this will be based on ignorance, is that where local authorities have acted, it's been in a sense influenced by funding from the Assembly. So our active travel fund, which is to promote some of those scenes we saw in Cardiff of cycleways, was dependent on them making bids against money according to a set of criteria which would have been drafted in accord with the Act. I'm just curious whether the Act has actually influenced independent action by local authorities, and whether that's in the 2020 report in any way.
Hi, Sandy.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Oh, sorry, everybody.
There's two things. One, somebody was just asking one of the questions. The other was somebody said that we didn't see the 6 principles slide.
Okay.
We lost your presentation on that.
The 6 principles, okay, essentially. So the first one is around reducing carbon emissions, sort of faster and deeper. I'm not going to remember these all in order now. There's one about committing to climate assemblies, people's assemblies. One of them is around making sure that when we calculate our carbon footprint, we take into account all of our global emissions. So sometimes some of those calculations don't take into account, for instance, stuff we buy. And, if that's manufactured in China, then it doesn't count as our emissions, it counts as China's. And so that's what that one's about. One of them is to take account of the future well-being of future generations. And number 6 is about jobs and the green economy. So launching a kind of green revolution so that we are creating a new kind of sustainable economy in some of the emerging sectors. And our team's doing a lot of work around this at the minute and around skills in the green economy and where there are sort of equality gaps. So we've just commissioned some research showing that there's potential for thousands of jobs in things like renewable energy, retrofit, but at the minute, women and people of colour and disabled people are underrepresented in those sectors, and so we're making recommendations to government of what they could do about that. So I suspect that might only been 5 of the 6, but that's my best attempt at remembering them without risking the slides again. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Right, then the question that Jim asked just before was, she said the examples that you gave were links to funds directly from the Assembly, like active travel. Got any examples where local authorities have acted in accord with the Act, but independent of external funding?
Independent of external funding, well, so the purpose of the Act is that it applies across all funding and all expenditure that a public body would make. So technically that applies to all of their expenditure. So it shouldn't require any additional funding to implement the Act. So this is one of the things that sometimes is criticised, and people will say, oh, but the Social Care and Wellbeing Act came with funding attached, and therefore it's been easier to implement. But that's kind of one of the whole points of it, is that it should just be applied across the board. So I suppose maybe the question about the additional funding was, did Cardiff get additional money? So I'm not sure actually on where all of the money came from do that, but my understanding it was reallocation of money that would otherwise have been spent elsewhere. Sorry, I'm multitasking. I'm being asked to put pajamas on. My daughter on the side. So, and that's one of the key things we focus on. It's reallocation of money, so that money should be reallocated from expenditure on roads and car travel to active travel.
Can I ask a rider, Sue?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Sandy, sorry, notwithstanding your daughter's pajamas, hi. Yeah. I'm just curious, would the Act, for instance, prohibit a local authority from reopening, say, a coal mine or developing a coal mine, as in Cumbria? And has it got any retrospective power so that we know Cardiff is planning a second waste incinerator?
Yeah.
So where would the Act stand in relation to those two potential local authority acts? Well, one is an actual act action, and the other is a potential one. Yes.
So in terms of sort of future actions, so if we were to be in a kind of Cumbria-esque scenario with a new open cast coal mine being proposed, then I think the Act can't technically prohibit, because it doesn't sort of proscribe individual scenarios, but I think what we would be looking at then is something very similar to what happened with the M4, which is that the Act can kind of be used to mobilise that argument against something that would be so very clearly against the interests of future generations. So yeah, my understanding is that would be a perfect example of a way it could be used. And so the similar case is true, really. I don't think it can be used retrospectively for decisions that already have been made, but in terms of that second incinerator plan, I think it's absolutely something that could be used to say, for instance, for Cardiff's wellbeing objectives, that activists could use that to say, well, this contravenes, if this goes ahead, then it contravenes this objective, and it doesn't meet the Act in these ways. So I think that's how it would be applied. At the minute, it can't be used to completely prohibit something, but to facilitate that argument to be made.
Judy, are you going to take over the questioning now?
Yes. Okay. I think we should go back to the first one, which Alison asked. Alison, are you there? Do you want to ask your question, or shall I read it out? It's about people, health boards having signed up to the Act, but doesn't look as if they're doing much to adhere to it.
If I just add, if you think, particularly with car usage, all the hospitals are being centralised, you know, these huge, becoming much bigger rather than small local places. So that encourages much more car usage. I mean, the plastics is a tricky one because obviously with COVID, you've got to have disposable stuff. But I know somebody mentioned to me who works in the NHS, you know, said that there's just everything is disposable. It's just there's no thought, seems to be no thought at all for recycling. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. So absolutely, it should and does apply to all of those decisions. And I think, you know, one of the things that we're doing with public bodies like the health boards is working with them to help them see how the Act can apply across everything that they do, rather than just sort of a little bit here and a little bit there. So an example that came up recently was thinking about, you know, global responsibility, goal number 7, and you know, that maybe say a local, say if a health board has said that it's going to make sure that all of the tea and coffee it sells in its cafeteria are fair trade, for example, but sort of pushing further to say, well, yeah, but where do you source all of your medical products from? You know, what's the supply chain implications on that, and sort of pushing them further. So we've just done a big report that we're about to release all about procurement, and I think procurement's not a very exciting term, but in terms of where all that money is spent by the public bodies, that's I think where a lot of the difference could be made.
Okay.
That helped.
The next question is from Urban Foundry.
Gordon, my name is.
Hi, Gordon.
That's all right. Well, I actually got 2 in there. I might as well just do them.
Okay.
The simple one is that the A48 road scheme outside Cardiff Castle, which is an absolutely brilliant initiative that they did there. Are we aware that it's being made permanent? I heard it might be temporary, and that would be tragic, of course. The other question was much more general. I wrote down, to what extent do you think that the first item of the report, i.e. applying well-being economics in all policies, is actually being, you know, is in traction, is actually getting resonance? I know there's lots of fine words said about these things, but what's the reality of that vital thing being built into all policies? A wonderful statement.
So on the first bit about the Cardiff scheme, I'm not sure. So like you, I'd heard that maybe it will stay, maybe it won't, and that I think that decision is still pending. So we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I think it would be a real shame if that doesn't continue. And on the wellbeing economics, I think with anything like this, it's, you know, we're sort of on a journey towards that, aren't we? This is where I see the movement for change having a big input, and you know, different organizations like yourselves in helping to kind of push that agenda and make sure it's still kind of on politicians' minds. So I think in particular with the elections coming up, that's an opportunity for us to try to, you know, vote for wellbeing economics policies where we see them. But yeah, I don't think we're there yet. I think it's talked about more, but it's something that we need to keep pushing and making a case for. But I think the Welsh Government has committed to wellbeing economics as a principle, but now it's about sort of seeing that filter through and affect all of their policy making at every level. So yeah, a work in progress, I think.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you. And Jeff has a question about pollinators.
Yes, well, it wasn't really a question. I've made a couple of statements. I'm basically a farmer. I grow food for people through community projects, but the situation is really dire at the moment. We've not only we lost our ability to understand the value of nature, and things like wildflower meadows, which have all been, you know, which has just been turned into grass for sheep. So we've lost a huge amount of our meadows, and as a result, a huge amount of our pollinators. This is going to affect us going forward. We are not self-sustaining in food production in Wales. And really, the bottom line is, if we can't feed ourselves, I'm afraid there won't be a sustainable future at all. So it's a matter of realizing that, you know, implementation of the Act is much more challenging than anyone realized when it was drafted. And it's not like a matter of sticking a plaster on the existing system. It needs to be reviewed, and reviewed at depth, and involving everyone in society, not if they happen to manage to catch a seminar, but this is about how people act on a day-to-day basis. And if we can't change that, we're in dire straits. We will persist, but if we lose our pollinators, we're going to lose our food supply, and we're going to be dependent on very, very shaky supply chains going forward. I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, here. No, I completely agree with all of that, Jeff. Yeah, diolch.
Okay.
I don't know if you want me to come back on it, but I was just going to add that I think, you know, all of this around, you know, local food systems and making sure that we have sustainable means of growing food close to where people live is really key to a lot of this, isn't it? And it really, I think, illustrates one of the ways in which everything's interlinked as well, and that food production is so intimately linked with the biodiversity crisis. So yeah, really echo everything Jeff said.
Right. We've
Thanks
got
for that.
Do you want to say anything to that, Jeff?
Well, I would just say, you know, that I just think we need to look at policies. For instance, you know, there are very, very few food production facilities in Wales anymore. You know, so that's something we really need to address at a government level. We're still selling off county farms in Pembrokeshire to rich people in England that want to turn them into caravan sites. How does this make any sense in terms of the Act?
Yeah, there's still an awful lot that we need to change, isn't there? Yeah. And for me, I think, you know, this is really where people like you, it's so important for us to be having these conversations and making these arguments, and for you all to feel empowered to be going out there and saying, look, these actions don't follow the Act. You know, what can we do to change these things? So yeah, I absolutely agree. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and it's about how we use the Act now, isn't it? And how we hold our leaders to account, I suppose.
Yeah, and how we can all work together to actually change this cycle that we found ourselves in since the 1950s. We used to grow hundreds and hundreds of acres of vegetables on the Gower. Now there's very few people such as ourselves that are just trying to bring that back. If government was really behind it, I'm not talking about photo ops, if they really were behind it, how are people supposed to sustain themselves if they can't get access to land?
Yeah. One of the pieces of work that our team is looking at the minute is proposals that have come in under a kind of green recovery fund, and a lot of those relate to land ownership and food growing schemes in particular. So yeah, I think this is an area we're really keen to have more of these conversations on. Thank you, Jeff.
Well, thank you for coming up with some answers.
I don't know if any of it really has answered, but yeah, I would love to hear from any of you, you know, as a follow-up as well, if you are involved in local projects and action on the ground that is really making a difference, then we're always really keen to hear from you, and case studies and what we can do to kind of connect these examples of people making a change, and help to sort of build that movement really. So absolutely, you know, follow up with me via Chris. He's got my contact details.
Oh, good. There are a few comments here about food strategy and community allotments, training people to grow things. A good Meadows program from the Centre of Alternative Technology. Somebody's suggesting that we should, everybody should fill in the climate survey that Swansea Council have sent out. There was another question from Jeff, or a statement. And somebody's asking you, somebody called Nick Samuel. Are you there, Nick? You're asking Sandy to present something to your students.
Yeah, I've written a postgraduate module based on the Future Generations Wales Act. It's designed to be delivered to full-time employed people who work in public bodies, which can include the blue light areas as well. And the first cohort are kicking off in a couple of weeks' time, and I was wondering if you'd be available just to run through a quick presentation to set the scene for them. The whole idea is that they look at the Act, they learn about the Act, and then they see what needs to happen to implement it in the workplace. And so it's getting right into the nitty-gritty of the work environment then, and spreading it through that way.
Yeah, really like bring it to life and in action. Yeah, that sounds brilliant, Nick. Maybe you could follow up with me via Sue, and we could have a look at dates.
I don't think I missed any questions, but in case I have, would you like to speak up now?
Margot has a question.
Okay. Margot.
Can you
unmute, Margot?
I'm making a couple of comments, but I've filled in that climate action survey, and I was surprised to see no reference at all to the wider food system. I know that quite a few other communities in Wales, in Crickhowell, in Pembrokeshire, in Ceredigion, and in Cardiff are looking at wider food system change along the lines of the Wales Food Manifesto. And it seems to me it's missing in Swansea. Maybe the other members of the group, when they fill in the climate action survey, might make some comments to that. I mean, it doesn't only belong in the climate action one, but that's the one they're asking at the moment. And if food doesn't get in there now, when people come off furlough and when there's changes in the food banks, and as Jeff said about the farming, there's no link, between food and farming in this region to make things better. Not really a question. The other thing is there's almost no link in the new white paper on agriculture to the food system. It's almost completely about the natural resource and farming, but not linking into the food system in towns and cities.
Yeah, it's an important link to be made. Thank you for sharing about the survey. That sounds really important for people to do that. Diolch, Margot.
Yeah, and you hope that, I mean, you mentioned on your slides about the well-being survey that Swansea did, and it actually was the example of one of the worst surveys I've ever seen. I mean, they'd already decided what the 4 areas were. That didn't come out of consultation. They decided on the areas, and each question, it was a 40-page consultation, and by page 5, you'd lost the will to live. Because, it's basically asking questions like, do you think health in Swansea, good health, is a good idea? I mean, literally, who is going to put no? So I think consultation has got to change. The way that people, they turn around and say to us, well, we've consulted them and this is what you wanted. Totally not true. They haven't consulted.
This is one of the things that we really need to see a bigger shift on with the Act is genuine involvement. And I think there's a big improvement on what happened the first time around. The pockets of involvement done really well, and in other areas not so well. And so I think there's been a lot of learning. So hopefully things will be more meaningful second time round.
Yeah, I mean,
and the frustration.
It is very very frustrating. And I mean, alongside, I mean, I see that Carrie has put up about the co-production. In Wales, the Welsh government constantly wants co-production, but it doesn't feel like everyone understands what it is or how to things. And you know, and I know that your job is yours is to try to help, but it does seem to me that co-production would be a really good way forward if people would do it. I don't know if you could say anything about that, Carrie.
Okay. So yeah, really good comment, Carrie. And there's quite a lot of work going into upskilling people that are involved. So I went to a session just this week with all of the public service board coordinators, and it was a session about co-production and upskilling people and sort of looking at what that means when it's done well. So watch this space.
Yeah,
there's another question. Dorothy, were you trying to say something? No? Well, Urban Foundry, again, was wanting to planning and development and highways to get you to be much more aggressive with. So would they like to put that statement maybe into a question? Are you there?
Yeah, I can always speak. Sorry. No, I just wanted to put that in. I think it's in one sense, and I think the Swansea survey is a good example of it. Green stuff is quite easy just now, and you know there's money for putting trees in, and the Assembly's committed for that, and all that green stuff is all very nice and well. But I think, as wisely pointed out on the chats and elsewhere, things like the food system, food production, local suppliers, the role that national food suppliers are playing. I don't know, even just now, you think what Amazon's doing. These things are all really challenging for the local process. And it seems to me that we have to be much more aggressive towards, if you like, the not green stuff, you know, how we live in communities, what buildings they're building, how they're building communities, how they're making access to local resources part of the criteria by which developments are judged. You know, there's all sorts of nice buildings, a lovely biophilic thing going up in Swansea beside all our trees on the Kingsway. And you think, this is terrific. This has all got interesting ingredients, but are you building good towns? As somebody else in the chat says, is building an arena and widening the road and chopping down the trees part of the same culture? And that's the terrain that we have to get in amongst. I think more than anything, sorry, I'm going on a bit. I mean, the thing that I worry about with future generations, and I love it all, don't get me wrong, was I went through Local Agenda 21, and you know, local authorities were all, you know, all committed to it and doing all the stuff. And where do we get to with Local Agenda 21? Not very far. And we have to be much more aggressive, which is why Extinction Rebellion and the like are so important in the current climate. But we've got a hell of a lot of work to do. It's not all sweetness and light at the moment.
Yeah, no, here. Agree with all of that, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Wales is a farming community, isn't it? And unless we change agriculture dramatically on all counts, yeah, I mean, the food systems have to change. I think there's, you know, and that's going to be really hard. And I understand that Mark Drakeford has got guys with massive chicken farms pouring out literally shit into the environment. And it's hard because these people are powerful and they don't want to change. Anyway, we have come up to the end of the allotted time for the session.
Just got one quick question, I think, or statement from Chris about citizens' assemblies being much needed. Chris?
Oh, it's just, I think it's something we all agree on, really. And I think it's something that would address the many voices, you know, and I just think I wish people would adopt that as a real way forward for change. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, really. And to thank Sandy for coming, and it's really interesting and good to hear, you know, a little debate about those things too.
Yeah, no, thank you again for the invitation, and we'll keep pushing on the people's assemblies, and I know that XR are doing, and it's good to see Blynydd Gwent are in the process of planning a local people's assembly, so that's a step in the right direction. I think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that. But thank you all so much for all of your comments and reflections, and for me this is completely about, you know, what the involvement side for our office is about. It's about speaking with all of you and hearing from you about, you know, what you think needs to happen, and the difference, the gap that you see between that vision of where we should be and the reality now is really essential. So I'm glad that this has been recorded, and I'll be able to get colleagues to watch this bit. I think would be really useful, this discussion. So yeah, thanks once again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for coming and for your talk, and for everyone else for coming. We hope to see you at the next one.
Diolch yn fawr. Hwyl.
Diolch.